Hello and welcome to the NorthTech webinar series powered by Accubits. For centuries, mankind has used Polaris, the North Star, to navigate and explore the world. Inspired by this, the idea behind our webinars are to discuss technologies, innovations, and explore its impact on navigating us to a brighter and better world. My name is Shamir Taha. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Accubits, and I'll be your host and moderator today. This webinar series is an initiative of Accubits that is a leading software engineering services firm with expertise in emerging tech such as AI and blockchain. Welcome again. In today's episode, co-hosted by 460 Degrees, we will be discussing smart cities, emerging tech, and the pandemic. Today, we have with us an amazing lineup of panelists who are experts and thought leaders in their fields. Let's start with a quick introduction, just under a minute, from our panelists here today. So let's start with Sue Bryant.
Oh, hi. Hi, everyone. My name's Sue Bryant, and I work for 460 Degrees. 460 Degrees is an expert management company, and part of the group has a practice around 5G and smart cities. And so I'm the Melbourne champion, or if you like, principal for smart cities and 5G in Melbourne.
Thank you, Sue. Good to have you with us. Next up, could we hear from Frank?
Thanks, Shamir. My name's Frank Zeitner. I'm the CEO of the Internet of Things Alliance Australia. We're the peak industry body for IoT with industry, government, research and community. About 1,000 people working across 12 work streams. And our remit is to accelerate the adoption of IoT through the economy and society for our competitive advantage and societal benefit. Amongst those 12 work streams, we have 7 that are sectoral, including smart cities, transport, food and ag, manufacturing, water, energy, and one other that I always forget. Suffice to say, IoT affects every business and every consumer in the country.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, good to have you with us, Frank. Next up, Barry, could you introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, I'm Barry Lerner from 460 Degrees. I'm the partner for 5G and for Smart City. We concentrate on how IoT can, get more enabled for smart cities, and how we can do cloud and such things, and all the new technologies and how you integrate them.
Thank you, Barry. And next up, we have George Sebastio. He needs little introduction, but please, for the audience and the panelists here, please introduce yourself.
Yes, this is George Sebastio. I am typically a CTO, a CISO, Chief Technology Officer, Chief Information Security Officer, but I'm also CEO for the ADO, which is part of Alternative Development Organization. And we have a group called the Global Blockchain Organization. And being CEO of GBO within ADO enables us to help the promotion of blockchain technology and this new generation of projects, be it the governmental or enterprise. As we know, in smart cities today, we generate humongous amounts of data. So key elements, especially in smart cities, is to make sure that we can trust the data that is being generated at the same time as we provide also identification and authentication as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, George. And thank you for being with us today. And last but not the least, we have Jitin VG. Jitin, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Shamir. Hi, everyone. My name is Jitin. I'm the CEO of Accubits. And as Shamir was mentioning, Accubits is a software consulting firm which is currently in 9 countries, focused on emerging tech, blockchain and AI. Throughout the last few years, we got a chance to kind of work with organizations like NASA, USPS, USGS, US Homeland Security, Apple, Smart Dubai, Singapore MOE, and all that. And we also work with a lot of these smart cities, especially Smart City of Barcelona and numerous others here in India and Africa, to kind of help them with emerging tech on connecting people better, helping them with the privacy and surveillance, and also on situations like the one we have right now, the pandemic, to effectively do contact tracing and all that. And we, as a company, Accubits, we also invest in startups. So we have invested in 12 startups so far. So many of them are, in line with what we're, about the conversation that we are having today, which is relevant to smart cities and all that. And then we have also 4 different products, and now we're also launching the world's best blockchain enterprise satellite into the space.
Thank you, Jitin, and thank you for the panelists for the wonderful introduction. So before we begin, for the audience that is joining in today, a warm welcome to you all. Feel free to use the chat window to leave any questions that you may have for our panelists here today, and we'll do our best to answer them towards the end of the session. So the topic today is about smart cities, emerging technologies, and the pandemic, the relation between them, its impact, and how technologies can actually help. So to start off with, we'll start with the panel discussion, and we'll have a series of questions among the panelists. So the first question for today, and let's start with, so Sue, you will be doing a keynote presentation. Please feel free to participate in the panel if you would like. So let's start with Barry. So managing natural disasters and disaster risk management has gained prominence in recent years, especially with recent events and the pandemic. How has technology helped? And can you give some examples of strategies adapted by smart cities and governments in the recent times?
Yeah, definitely. Things have changed. We are now more proactive. We're not waiting on things such as, weather, environmental, fire, even COVID. We're not sitting back and waiting for reactions. We're taking the advantage now. So we're more in that way. We've come to expect technology to ensure our safety now. So, we lean towards that. Like, we're all waiting for the vaccine so we can go upon our business, right? And we expect a vaccine. We're not hoping for one. So things have changed that way. And, you'll start to see now drones are starting to come in, where we're doing visuals, we're monitoring with the drones, we're looking at where crowds are, we're using monitors now and sensors to establish and understand where, fire is coming from and different things. One of the unique ones that I've seen is that we're now deploying ozone sensors so that we can understand where people who formulate in crowds develop some skin cancers and things like that. So shades could be put up. So we're using technology to satisfy all these new requirements that are developing. So that's a little bit on that.
That's amazing. And so I'm sure there's a lot of data being flown, especially with all these systems in place. Is that a challenge that is being seen in smart cities?
Yeah, usually a challenge, right? Everybody agrees that data is the utopia, and we all try to figure out how do we share data. How do we really utilize data? Capturing data is one thing, but the utilization of it for different ideas. We're even looking at utilizing data to capture anonymously now, so that we're trying to satisfy. The major requirement is that, I'm not being monitored by Big Brother, that I can go ahead now and understand a lot about myself, understand a lot about what's going on in the environment, but not giving away the information. Just as here in Sydney, there's a big new norm now with data, right? I go to a restaurant, I show my phone against a QR, takes all the information, and if they're hopefully nothing happens, but if there's a COVID person out there who's got the virus and he happened to be there, they can correlate that I was there and notify me, which is one of the ways of doing it, and they can do it almost anonymously because they're just using your phone number. So that's one of the ways data is now playing a major role.
Thank you, Barry. Frank, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, it is all about the data, and that is the number one thing. A pandemic and disasters have a way of making the data way more important. So bushfires are a classic case. All those disasters have a common issue. It happens in a lot of places at once, and that means it's very hard to deploy people and resources without knowing where and when and how and which is most important. And that requires data, and as a result, there's a lot more searching for how can we get data on fuel load, propensity to burn, predictive models in bushfire situation. In a pandemic, it's exacerbated by the fact that not only do we need to collect the data, but we can no longer collect the data personally. We need to get it. We need to get it remotely. We need to get it regularly, and so. In many cases, we don't have or didn't have the data. And that's either on where the people were, where the infected people were, and indeed where the supply chain issues were as well to support, provision of PPEs, etc. So that's driven a heck of a lot of activity in applications and of collecting and sensors for collecting and of data. And then the second thing it's done is created this real need to know how to and under what circumstances one could share the data. Mm-hmm. And so the great thing is that a pandemic forces us to make decisions about when is the bargain for sharing data the right one against the issue for which you're sharing it. So, for example, it took us years and years and years to share data about hospital beds between hospitals, and all of a sudden it became available because we had a pool of hospital beds for ICU. We needed to know where they were. So what was seemingly difficult, and we already had the data, we just didn't share it. And even further, New South Wales has quite been leading in one area in coming up with quite an advanced model for privacy preserving data sharing frameworks, which said for these circumstances, for these cohorts, for these size of cohorts, we can share data without revealing personal information that is still valuable and necessary to actually make operational decisions. And so that's quite sophisticated. It's actually now looking at being, well, we're trying to make it a global standard. That'll take a few years, but maybe that's one of the reasons that New South Wales is in a reasonably good state. So there's a number of layers of that data, of the requirements for data that pandemics and disasters become a catalyst for.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for those examples as well. George, you've been working with smart cities quite a bit. Please share your thoughts on this as well.
I think that is very important, I think, is 3 or 4 elements. Of course, we know that the data is the key element. Here, blockchain plays an important role because it allows you to protect the data and to enable you to share the data in a distributed way and to maintain ownership of the data. But apart from the elements of IoT protection of the data, I think a few other elements are extremely important. One of them is the capability of transporting the data more effectively. So things like 4G, 5G enable this to happen. So this sometimes we call 5G like fiber over the air. So this enables us to transport a much larger amount of data. Now, because we're dealing with the data, we are trying to process this data with better intelligence. We can call it big data, artificial intelligence. When this happens, one of the things that is also taking place is where are we selecting the processing power to take place. So traditionally, this has always been in our concentrated data centers. But because we're dealing with large amounts of data, this is not always practical or possible. So this enables us to move the processing of the data to the edge. Now, the edge could be the smart camera, or the edge could be your mobile device. So this enables us to do a whole new generation of applications. Some of them Accubits has worked on, for example, small lightweight application that is able to process an image and identify if a person is wearing a mask or not wearing a mask correctly. We can do, of course, things like voice recognition. We can do things like face recognition for identification purposes. So when we combine all these elements together, it allows us to select where we process this data in a much more effective way without necessarily having to transport the data. So that means once the processing of the data has been done by AI, we simply need to transport the status about the data rather than the entire data. So on one side, we protect the privacy associated with this data. On the other side, the activity and the architecture for smart city becomes a lot more efficient instead of simply transporting this massive amounts of data around the entire infrastructure.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, George. Thank you for that. Jitin, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, so the way I see this, the ability of humanity to kind of combat natural disasters, be it driven by the weather and climate, or by a novel virus like what we have right now, it's probably a three-step process. The first step, that's probably where we are right now, is being able to collect all these data, as rightly mentioned by Frank, Barry, and George here, right? And then analyze it and come up with certain key insights which can actually help us with, planning and, figure out, what should go where and what should be the right strategy, what we should do and all that. And the second step from a species perspective on the same topic for us probably is being able to use that data efficiently from different sources and create a digital twin of that city or that community perhaps, right? So that, you can actually predict the future, right? So this happens, or you can sort of simulate different situations very precisely, not the way we do right now. We still have a certain amount of predictions going on, but then it's very partial because there are so many different attributes out there. We are not able to kind of calculate for all those variables at the moment. It's always partial. So, but what I mean by digital twin of a city or a community is that you have all these attributes, people moving, kind of people, their demographics, the weather, all that, right? And then you have a very sophisticated system which can actually predict, this is what's going to happen here. In fact, I think, in Dubai, they had an initiative which was exactly looking at it. And, we've been part of that initiative in for its first stage, which is the data exchange, right? Securely sharing data between all the enterprises and, government agencies across the city so that, they have this wealth of data which people can, or entities can use to analyze and, figure out what's going on. But that's still on the stage one. It hasn't reached the stage two yet. And the stage three, I think, which is pretty exciting for us and probably would be the biggest one, is the geoengineering side, right? So if you've been following the news lately, there is a new vertical altogether called geoengineering, where some incredible people and scientists are using different technologies to kind of tweak the nature a bit, right? So, we need a little more rain. Yeah, you got it, right? So I think, that's coming. And I think, that's where our future is. And that's one way to kind of protect people, environments, cities from all these different natural disasters. And, I believe that, soon, or probably over the next 10 to 15 years, we will reach the stage three where, maybe not completely, but then, we'll still have certain technologies which can tweak the nature a bit. And I think, that would be, and it's not science fiction anymore, right? So there are so many people who are actually working on it. There are so many tech which is already out there, trying to solve climate change, extreme weather situations and all that. So that's where I see this going from a weather perspective. And perhaps, and maybe from a pandemic perspective, there are two different aspects to it, right? One probably, is from a health aspect, which we probably have figured out already with non-pharmaceutical intervention tech and all that, right? Being able to, and there are so many models out there, especially from Metabiota, this company based out of the US, which has one of the most sophisticated models for a pandemic, just like the Sears or Sear model that we have, right? Which can accurately tell you like how this pandemic is, or any virus is actually spreading across countries or states or districts or even the Twin Cities, right? So, prediction over there, I think, it's already in place, but other technologies to kind of fight the non-pharmaceutical intervention tech, which is there. But so I think, but it also poses another big challenge, which is from a national security point of view, not just health perspective, right? So, now all of a sudden, everybody has seen how a novel virus could affect, countries which are even spending $1 trillion into their defense. And all of a sudden, everybody realized that, you do not have to kind of build missiles. All that I have to do is, do a gain of functions with these viruses, which is much easier compared to building missiles. So I think, that's also coming, right? So the bio war and, all these hostile actors are going to be using a lot of these. I'm just concerned about it. So that's how I think, we can fight, natural disasters, be it weather or pandemic or, things on that line.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
I wanted to add one important thing or two things to what Jintin was saying. The interesting aspect about Dubai is a small, big city in the sense we can experiment with all those things. We've experimented in the context of, for example, smart driving, in which we are able to predict traffic jams and then redirect traffic. So this is done conjunctly with the RTA, where we use the combination of models of events scheduled in the city, weather, etc. The third element that he mentioned was about geomodification. And yes, Dubai is also playing with that. We do cloud seeding all the time. Yeah. But from time to time, we do over cloud seeding. So we created floods with this idea. So I think sometimes we need to tune the
models, George. Yeah.
So
I think wrong models.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and also I'd like to pick up on, there are technologies that are capable of many things, but in my experience, and there's like 530 councils in Australia, is the adoption is the issue. It's not the technology and the understanding. And so we are a long way away from adoption. So all of these, so until we start getting that sorted through, and that's explaining a pathway to get to adoption that makes sense, that that is scalable, we're going to be dragging. So pandemics have another effect, is it galvanizes funding. It sort of kickstarts things where cities and themselves by themselves aren't able, and that starts creating an environment where that can happen. So all of this is interesting, but I can tell you that the actual data is very spotty. A lot of it's very unreliable, and most of it isn't authenticated. So plenty of opportunity to improve the situation, and the technologies are there to do it. But because it's a complex question, it's getting the people who have the funds and who are in charge to understand what they can do, and that's, for me, that's the big challenge.
Yeah, sure. I completely agree to that as well, Frank. While we're working with all these so-called smart cities, always the biggest challenge is that, a lot of these data are still not there, right? And even if it's there, somebody is scared to share it, even within the governments, right? And if it's received, and people doesn't really know how exactly to use it, and in a bigger picture. So I think it's time for us to come up with a new term, perhaps like super smart cities, because smart cities is not doing much right now, right? So and figure out and like you said, increase these adoption. But I think people would people would like this if it's not compromising their privacy, plus and adding value to their life, and if the governments are able to facilitate a better service to these people. But the fact I believe is that a lot of these organizations and governments are still not really ready to get into a data-driven stage, right? So we are still, democracy as it is, and it's very emotionally driven, right? So it's all about what the person is saying, and how he is saying it, and how he is approaching it, and all that. So I think, like you said, once that sentiment changes, and the situations like this pandemic, and and extreme weather situations always give people a better perspective of what's actually happening, or what's their reality, right? And kickstart these innovations, and I hope it kind of starts. And
Absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we're moving
I think
from
George is talking. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I like the point that you mentioned about adoption, because I think we always seem to forget, yes, it's about the data, but it's also about the user. So the elements that I think are key to adoption are, on one side, ease of use. So a lot of focus on the UX aspect of adoption. So that means you need to create better interfaces with mixed reality, augmented, virtual reality, etc. Much easier to use. So full stack development, but with UX focuses. The second thing that I think is important with adoption is education, training, and awareness, so that we transfer, because users move much slower than technology. And if that is not there, then the users, and the last point I think about adoption is to create the element of trust with the user. So the user will only start adopting or changing its behavior if he actually trusts the technology. Otherwise, he finds a way around the technology.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, like what Jatin mentioned, we're moving towards intelligent cities now. So, I mean, I know we've kind of touched upon the next question that I had, but this is an open question for all the panelists here. How have governments or cities in general globally adopted technology or executed strategies to combat COVID-19?
Do you want an honest answer or something just for the session?
Let's hear it from everyone. It's an open question.
Yeah, so
I think Barry is trying to talk. Just a minute. Barry, you're on mute. Yeah.
I told it before too. I think that right now some of the cities, right, the advanced cities, they're looking at how am I going to, you have to control this thing, right? And we all know that with COVID, we talk about, you need to use masks. You can't be in crowds. That there's all this different information, and they're looking at how can I monitor people and how can I monitor situations like a beach. If I can understand that there's a lot of people at the beach, I can go in and send a drone over and tell people to separate nicely, without threatening them, right? Because we know now that realistically, a lot of the cultures are, they feel that I shouldn't wear a mask, and you can't force people to do anything. So how can you go in there politely, maybe by drones, where you can go in and just announce, you need to move on. We understand basically that, outside of certain buildings and everything, people seem to congregate, and maybe we can disperse that, So we see IoT in a lot of places being able to do those kind of things and analyze and understand that, hey, this particular area, has a high rate of COVID right now, and we can correlate that to people hanging around here and doing these things. And certain cities are doing what they call the box technology now, where they're collecting information, analyzing information on known things, and then destroying that information. Therefore, protecting the people's, anonymous, people's, information. So I think that, the way they're going about the collecting the data, the analyzing data, and the way that they're going to use data And again, I think the final part is, and we've left this out, is about monetizing data. Everybody, all cities, all governments are trying to understand how can I monetize that data so that I can pay to do more smart things.
Right. Absolutely. Thanks, Barry. Anyone else?
Since you talked about the point about monetizing the data, I do believe that this point is better implemented in what we sometimes refer, and governments have been adopting this very heavily in the Middle East, is what we call PPPs, or private and public partnerships. So government and private industry have been cooperating together to monetize this data. So whether that is for e-commerce purposes, or for educational purposes, or for behavior transformational purposes. And the reason why the private sector plays an important role here is simply because the private sector moves much faster than government does. So they're able to bring those initiatives in a much more effective way. And I think cities today are going to be using much more frequently the concept of what I sometimes call the carrot and the stick. Now, the carrot is how do I reward people for good behavior, and the stick is how do I enforce behavior by fines or other approaches, you know, good cop, bad cop approach. And I think if we find the right mixture of this and we adapt it to the local cultural level, then I think we can achieve a much better effectiveness rate of impact of the solutions.
Well, a classic case of how collecting data makes a huge difference is in the use of renewable energies, solar energy off roofs, basically demand side management and alignment with behaviours. And right now, all the old distribution models of energy pretty much had none of that data, averaged everybody, and then designed and overbuilt systems to accommodate a worst case scenario, not a worst case, but a sort of a conservative case for how you build a distribution network. The opportunity for us to radically change how efficiently we use our energy in the home, because one, customers might even know how they use it themselves, and two, how they might bargain about when they might use it to optimize price, you know, so tariff incentives, etc., is incredible opportunity. Australia's energy productivity is half of that of Germany. So there's a long way to go in improvement, and having the data at user level and with incentives, etc., is a very, very powerful example of how monetizing data has not only an effect on making it more affordable, reducing the demand for baseload creation anyway, which also saves money, and helps the planet. So it's a three-way, it's a triple helix benefit by simply having data available. So there's a classic case of how cities can use data.
One last point I wanted to maybe also bring, I think is quite important, is the concept I sometimes call touchless economy. So I think there's been a lot of change in this area. So very simple changes. For example, you go to the restaurants today, there's no menu. The menu is simply a QR code. Your mobile and you're able to view the menu. Payment systems, where we use a lot more contactless and cashless approaches towards payment. Of course, China has led this with WePay for a long, long time. But today, in even places like the Middle East, this is leading in the areas of the transformation. So there's a lot of less paper, less cash, less touchless. So this also, or sometimes also referred to as frictionless approach towards information transfer.
True. And, on the point that both of you made, the smart city model is about incentivizing citizens to kind of, promote good behavior, build sustainability, build a more sustainable economy and a green city. And any sort of actions that can actually instill that behavior is what we are trying to drive towards. And data, like you said, is a critical part of that. And unless we understand, what is being generated be it energy, waste management, we can't really drive those decisions. Jitin, do you have any thoughts on this point?
Yeah. So I think governments across the world has adopted technologies for multiple things to kind of combat COVID, right? So one for sure is that all the comtech or communication technologies and collaboration technologies, they started actively adopting it. Because they could not go to offices, and they still wanted to kind of build these task forces, to kind of combat virus. So that was definitely actively happening, and I think that's a great thing, because it takes a long time and for these governments to digitally transform themselves. I personally think COVID has accelerated that, and they also made a lot of these services completely digital. Right, so the passes, or traditionally, especially here in India, things that you have to kind of go to these government offices for, which was extremely ineffective, right, and completely paper-based. So I think a lot of these services were moved to a complete digital ecosystem. I think to kind of still maintain the harmony of the cities, and then the technologies which can have a direct impact on combating COVID, right? Automating contact tracing, or exposure analysis, or even detecting or enforcing social distancing, and people wearing masks and all that, right? With video and image analytic solutions. I just do not think they have implemented that really well. Some governments did, right? So Singapore, for example, did a great job in implementing contact tracing. China did, but they also took a lot of these draconian measures, which is not ethical, right? But a lot of government used a lot of these contact tracing technologies. I know this because we have a product which does exactly the same, and we speak to a lot of these governments. Technology is not the solution, right? It's just very passive. It can actually assist you, but then you still need the rest of the policies and the decisions. You need to act with that. You need to work with all that information. Just buying the technology doesn't solve any problem, right? So
absolutely.
I think that's what is missing. A lot of governments has adopted these contact tracing systems, and all these technologies, but not really using it, or not really leveraging on its capabilities. And one of the interesting thing, but this is not the present. This is perhaps the future. Maybe 2 years from now. Two different technologies I see coming out of this COVID situation. I think both of them are for good. So if you go a bit behind in history, right? So to the First World War, the First World War gave us automated machine guns and probably aircraft carriers, right? And the Second World War gave us atomic bombs. And we know that in the Third World War, if there is going to be a Third World War, it is not going to be fought with machine guns, right? We'll just use it to kind of threaten the other guys. But we probably never use it, because most of these are nuclear countries right now. So it probably is going to be fought with viruses and cyber attacks, rather than actual weapons of destruction. And it turns out COVID proved that such a novel virus, and not so harmful as well, right? But with a bigger R0 value. What it has told us is that even United States, which is a country which spends like $1 trillion into its defense budget, right, is not capable of fighting a novel virus or a situation like this, right? And same with every other countries. Look at the impact COVID had on our economies. India's GDP dropped by 23.7%. It's first time over the last 40 years. So right now, all the enemy states or all these hostile actors just realize that, I do not have to build missiles, which is just a pure waste of time. All that I have to do is, do that gain of functions research on some virus, which a lot of countries has been doing, state-funded researchers. You can see that, all across internet, there was multiple researchers from United States, Libya, Syria, and all these different countries on gain of function research, which is much easier compared to missiles. So you do that, you weaponize a virus, inject that into somebody, and get them to travel to all these major metros. That's it, guys. You don't need nukes anymore, right? So I think just like the defense system which every other countries have right now, I think we are going to have these systems which can anti-bio war systems, right? Which I believe is non-pharmaceutical tech, but time will tell for sure, right? So that is one. And then I think these different technologies which governments are using right now. So a lot of countries are adopting or have already adopted the digital passes, right? Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like the health pass. Singapore has done it. I think they're starting to do it. China has done it. So over the next 2 years, right, if people are using it, so there is a saying, if somebody is using something for, if they keep on doing it for 21 days, and it will start with behavior, right, or it starts getting into a habit. So if, my assumption is that, if this keeps on happening, probably we'll start using digital passes with everyone else, right? So for example, if I know that, I have a infectious disease, then, my doctor probably would put that into a QR code. And in future, maybe, when I meet another person, even before a handshake, I probably scan his QR code and make sure that he's clean, maybe from STDs or, any sort of these contagious diseases. And which is also good for the planet, right? And if you think about it, all these pharma companies are making most of their money from all these contagious diseases. I mean, it's very easy to kind of stop it even without drugs. You just make sure that it doesn't spread from one host to another. And, you can build that herd immunity with technology. And I think, technologies like this would be more prominent in the future, given that, the governments would adopt it right now.
Absolutely. No, thanks for that, Jiten. I think, like you said, it's not just a technology solution. It's about, what the governance around this is as well. In fact, one of the audiences, Krishan Wright, thanks for the comment. He's mentioned that policies and benefits can drive the adoption, which is absolutely right. We're actually seeing that even in Dubai, and George can attest to this, the government has actually implemented, we've gone ahead with a blockchain strategy for the city of Dubai. We have a paperless strategy. And the success of that is truly about implementing the policies that can actually drive the adoption for such critical, government-related transactions as well. So on that note, let's move on to the next topic. So this, I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting topic. Security. It's about security and surveillance. What I'd like to hear from the panelists here today is, from your experience, what are the opportunities in security and surveillance of public and private infrastructure, and how do you tackle privacy issues? We've heard, the big brother concept and all of that. How do you think this is going to be tackled? Let's start with Barry.
Okay, so one of the things is security and surveillance. We're seeing a lot of opportunities in several areas. So we see them in seaports, airports, all the meetings. We see them on university campuses. And we also see another big need now is the prisons, because if you notice now that prisoners are smuggling in drugs by drones. So, they're already...
They've gone high tech.
Yeah, they become high tech. So, surveillance is a tough thing, right? Because it's all about capturing video, right? Understanding the environment around you, understanding that there are things like gunshot detections. There's different gases. There's all different parts, and a very important part is about call handling and the distribution of call handling. So it depends on the situation. Whether you need to contact the mayor and he's in charge, whether the chief constable and he's in charge. Or the head of health, education, all different ways of deciding who's going to be in charge of that precise situation. I've worked in a place where we put in a safe city. Things were monitored. There was an actual terrorist attack. The video had actually picked it up, identified the people, distributed to the military that sent it to the police, and eradicated the problem within a pretty good time. So again, it's all about setting it up. It's about getting the processes straightened out, and it's not that easy. It takes, a lot of people to sit down and to give up their governance, to go ahead and say, my budget is going to help you do that. And, so it's a major thing where you have to have the whole environment to buy into this thing. So it's not just the technology, I think, is the easy part. It's getting the budget, getting the processes, and getting the governance structured, to be honest. Okay.
Agreed. Thank you. Frank?
Yeah, and look, I think moreover, the problem is understanding the problem. I think people aren't that good at actually defining problems. As you sort of, this is particularly a problem for people that are trying to develop AI systems, for example, to come up with solutions, is you're trying to find out what do you want the solution to be, and the answer is we don't really know. And so it's pretty hard to come up with a policy on the we don't really know problem. And so that means that it's understanding the processes, understanding the rules and obligations, codifying them in software so that you can release the data to those who need to know, etc. You can do that, but you need to know what's the purpose, who the trusted people are that you can do it with. Those are the answers to those questions are the pieces of work that need to be done. And there isn't a culture of thinking that way for sharing data inside cities or inside corporations, generally speaking. It's sort of a open or shut thing, or commercial or not thing. It's not that nuanced sharing of data, which we're now starting to see with the sharing of COVID data in New South Wales, i.e. for health professionals or how much goes to the Premier, etc. But that is not understood as a way of doing things in cities. So for me, that's the target. And it does mean really understanding your business. It goes into other existential issues, which I fear to digress, but let me just go very quickly. Plenty of services are done by the private sector. The government's lumbered with the complexity of being the government and being able to mandate taking your data, which gives them a responsibility that's over and above that which you give to private companies, where you've already freely given it away, but only a small percentage of people have given it away. So governments are always going to be slower than private industry, and working out the bargain between government and private industry to bring in services that don't just satisfy those who have the money, but also satisfies everyone else who shares the load, that's the question. Not an easy one to answer. So, I mean, it's easy for me to say they don't know the answer to the question. That's because the question depends on how they balance it with private industry, and that's not an easy one. But it is our future, and so it's the most important one they need to answer.
Interesting. No, thank you for that, Frank.
There's one interesting aspect that I wanted to add here on the areas of security, and there's you can call it slightly a big change, because in some sense, we mentioned earlier, it's all about the data. So typically when we have smart cities and cybersecurity, in most cases, we have the big command and control center that is situated usually at the police station or some mayor's office where resources get deployed, etc. So this is a very centralized way to process information and decision making. So one of the big changes that is happening is this command and control center is actually moving much closer to the first responder, whether it happens to be a policeman or, for example, some healthcare worker or otherwise. So today, if you look at the modern Dubai police car, it is not a police car anymore in the traditional way. It is a police car that is actually the command center for that police. So that means we have a very large screen. Some of the cars have up to 9 cameras or even 11. So, and it is able to give the policeman a situational awareness about everything around him. These cameras are capable to do things like license plate recognition on the fly, face recognition, and automatically put up on the screen of who is the individuals around him and what is the situation with those individuals. Are they high risk, low risk, or have some historical background associated with them? We can take this a little bit one step further if we go to China, where the police were also equipped with smart glasses, and those smart glasses enable them to automatically see risk factors associated with people in the audience. So you point your glasses at a group of individuals, there's 5 individuals over there, and an individual X out of the 5 has some historical risks associated with them. So we can go back and take action, whether that action happens to be medical in nature, but sometimes it's fraud related or other response related to police department or first responders. So there's a big change on how we manage and react to the incident in real time by getting access to the information and the action closer to the first responder rather than all of this being centralized.
I think, just building on top of what George was saying right here, from a surveillance aspect in this world, there are, I think, 2 major categories, right? So one is the best example on the extreme right, perhaps, is China, right? They survey, they have surveillance cameras or tech all across, and like George was rightly mentioning as well, even the police have all these glasses which can facial recognition tech and all that. And on the far left, we probably see all these Scandinavian countries, which has very little requirement of surveillance, or have all these surveillance, or have already implemented this surveillance tech. So I do not think they have much. But the way this world is, whatever I'm saying after this, it's just strictly my hypothesis, and that's how I see the world going, right? What's happening is that because of COVID and because of all these very harsh economic situation, there is a common pattern that you can actually notice around the world. There are more civil wars. There are more people fighting against the governments. There are more people, this is happening all around the world, right? Brazil, US, India, in almost all the continents, right? People are fed up with the governments and they are trying to fight against it. And definitely, the way the government is going to respond at some point is perhaps by, figuring out how these people are fighting, where they are fighting. So by potentially implementing more surveillance tech, and I'm scared about that too. And I think, being tech providers, or we have a moral responsibility to make sure that this tech is not being used for something completely unethical or moral, against our morality, even for the governments, right? I mean, we as people need that freedom, and we have to make sure that the people have that freedom too. And I think all the tech providers, especially, we have a product which does exactly the same thing. I mean, does the facial detection, anomaly detection to see if people are fighting and all that. So I think, I feel that, I think, it's on us to make sure that, we do everything that we can potentially do to avoid a situation where, people doesn't have their freedom. But so we have to make sure that, the privacy is kept. We have to make sure that these tech doesn't cross certain boundaries in terms of what they do. But for sure, I mean, I think it can avoid certain big situations, like it can actually avoid robberies, which is great, and it can actually avoid people fighting against each other. There are video analytic tech which can actually make sure that people or enforce social distancing. There are the same AI solutions which can actually detect if there is an explosion, if there is an accident. So in these cases, technology can save people, right? I think, technologies like that, we have to actively market and, make sure that, governments, enterprises, and all these people adopt. But on the other side, we also have to make sure that, the rest of the world doesn't end up being like another China, right? So people still need to have their freedom. And as technology providers, we always have to make sure that, we do our part, not just look at the profits, but, we look at that moral, ethical side of it, making sure that, our freedom is protected, and our children also have that freedom, and they do not end up being, slaves to the government or that system.
Yeah,
Technology
that's
for
a great
good.
point. That's a great point, Ethan. And just going back to George's comment too about the adoption around trust. For me, all of this doesn't work unless there's trust. So if we don't trust how the technology is used, or that the technology is trustable, it won't happen. So some of you may have heard of something that we already know exists, which is we all have unconscious bias. And building in unconscious bias into our automated systems is another way of just reinforcing old stereotypes, which may not be the way that we want to go. Australian Human Rights Commissioner has a big thing about this, but he recently came up with a fantastic, interesting report, which has been verified all over the place, which is facial recognition systems famously are fantastic at recognizing white males, but are really bad at recognizing females who are non-white, and down to below 90% accuracy. So if that's what's stopping you from going through a passport turnstile, that's a bit of an issue. 10%, I don't think that's good enough. So I think we need to work on some of our unconscious bias and recognize what that really is. And so I think that there's going to be a lag on automated systems until we really know they're trustworthy.
True.
For sure.
Well, so with that, I would now, we've had a very interesting discussion, and thank you, panelists. You've been amazing, very active discussion. So at this point, I would like Sue to present the keynote for today. Over to you, Sue. You can share your screen with us.
Thank you, Samir, and thank you, guys. It was really interesting, and I think a lot of what you were talking about is covered in my presentation, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but suffice it to say, I think we all recognise that 2020 has not been a great year, and there's been a lot of issues around health and natural disasters in Australia. We have a lot of fires, and we have a lot of cyclones and things like that, as well as droughts. And so I think we've talked a lot about some of these different technologies around heat sensing and crowd management, and the fact that we need to better manage the environment. We need to better manage our traffic, so that people feel comfortable about using public transport instead of driving everywhere, which is a trait in Australia, that we drive all over the place. And of course we need to think about new systems for safe public safety. And of course, because of all the things that happened this year, our GDP in every country is down. So everybody's trying to figure out how are they going to restart the economy, how a business is going to get restarted. But I think, as Frank and a few others have said in the panel, a lot of these technologies are either here or about to be here in the future. And the problem is really more around how do I actually change the processes? How do we modify what was the previous norm into the new norm? And so all of these types of technologies fit under this umbrella of smart city, right? And so what I would like for us to think about, particularly in Australia, is to make maybe 2021 become smart city as the new norm, not as a thought that we're all thinking about. And so if I look at today in Australia around smart city, we have some quite progressive councils who really have embraced this notion and have started on a journey and have a plan and have some projects underway. But unfortunately, we have many councils who have not started yet. And so as I have worked on councils and governments around Southeast Asia and Australia, I think the starting point for most councils is around having that common city vision amongst a collective. And so smart city doesn't just mean it's about the local council, it means it involves the local community, the local businesses, as well as utility companies and transport companies. So a lot of people are involved in putting forward that smart city vision. And without having the collective, it's really hard to achieve. So after the vision, usually there will be some kind of digital foundation that is developed, and that foundation is normally a shared infrastructure, or it is best to have it as shared infrastructure. Today, what we see is lots of silo pilots, that might address one area, but could address another, and an easy way to think of that is particularly around the area of CCTV and video AI, so that particular type of solution can support multiple areas. It could support parking, traffic management, crowd management, public safety, so there's a lot of areas to think about. That's why it's best to have that stakeholder community there, that collective with a common vision. And from that, you can build a digital foundation that is used as a shared services environment. Right, and of course it's made up of the usual suspects like devices, connectivity, cloud, IoT, and of course the most important area being open data. And so when we've had a lot of conversation about this, and I know that Frank was talking a lot about data, and George was talking about using blockchain to manage data, and so it's on everybody's mind at the moment. In Australia, I would say that we have some initiatives around trying to standardise on data, but we're not there yet. And the point is that the data does need to be shared. It's not just about one set of data. So, as we move forward, we need to build a data framework, or we might call it a data strategy and guidelines. And it needs to include areas like how I collect the data and who's going to collect the data, because it's not just about council data. It could be about public transport data. Who owns the infrastructure that's going to analyze and store the data? So who would own that? Who actually owns the data is another big question, and it's a question that I think lots of people struggle with. And again, who accesses and who uses that data is another big issue. And, access needs to be extended not just to the public servants, but also to the community in some instances, as well as businesses. There's been cases that we've worked on in Southeast Asia where one local council, was a large one, decided to share their data with Pizza Hut delivery drivers, simply because it happened to be in Jakarta, but simply because they couldn't find their way through the traffic, and that's a good example of data being added together. And if we look at data singularly, the value is not always the same as when I actually aggregate data from different sources. So there's different ideas on who can access and who can use data. Management of the data is critical because we need to have data integrity. We can't be making decisions, particularly city critical decisions based on inaccurate data. So management of data and data integrity is important, and who is going to do that? And as we sort of started to talk a bit about monetizing data, and some folks have ideas around actually paying for data. Now, I don't know if that's an acceptable thing, or whether or not monetizing data could just mean simply, if I aggregate all this data, then I create efficiencies, and efficiencies can be monetized. So there's different ways of thinking about data. So some of the technologies, I just wanted to cover a couple of technologies that we see as becoming more critical as we move forward, particularly with collecting of data. And I think drones, whilst quite new, probably 4 or 5 years ago, have now actually become, or are becoming, the norm, and are becoming as critical as CCTV, because drones do carry cameras, right? And so if we look at drone technology, there's many different use cases that are out there today for collecting of information. Agriculture is one that I know in Australia we use drones today to go out and monitor, particularly on large cattle stations, to monitor cattle, and also to look at crops, as well as you know, the salinity and things like that of an area, whether it's suffering from drought in this area, you know, or there's enough water for the cattle. So agriculture is a large one. Conservation, I think, is a little bit more new. And I have worked in some of the Pacific Islands, and they were looking at putting drones out to decide to make sure that they can conserve some of the tropical rainforests, which I think is a very good idea, because people just can't get to that particular part of the island. And so conservation is an area where some people are looking at it. Definitely disaster mitigation and relief is critical, because we all know when disasters occur, most times people can't get there. And so the only way that we can actually really understand what is going on is by sending out things like drones to do surveillance. Filmmaking and photography is been around for a while, you know, with photojournalists and you know, people like Hollywood using drones to take photos of different areas. Law enforcement is obvious, and I know I live in Melbourne, by the way, and in Melbourne we've had lockdown for a while, and I know that there have been drones that have been making sure that we all don't go outside our 5-kilometre precinct. So, and I think that's a good thing to do. You know, it's good to have the police to have their eyes extended, you know, so that they can actually help control what's going on in a particular, in the pandemic that we're facing at the moment. And of course, we know that drones in the future won't replace the post office and the delivery service, but they'll definitely augment it, and it'll be part of their delivery mechanism. Rather than having people riding around streets on motorcycles delivering parcels, we will get them with drones, right? So drones, I think, are one of the new technologies, or the newer technologies, is really starting to emerge and take shape as the surveillance technology moving forward. And I know we talked a bit about this, but I think also CCTV, particularly when it's added to video AI, has come a long way. You know, I've been around now for about 30 years in the IT industry, and it's really only over the last 3 or 4 years that we've actually seen CCTV and video AI come into its own. So, you know, cameras nowadays are much smarter than what they used to be. I mean, a lot of the cameras that sit in our cities today are fairly dumb, and they just take video footage, and they really seriously need to be replaced. But we're now seeing CCTV cameras that even have some capability in it to do local video analytics before it passes that information off to the video AI system. And I know from working on projects around video AI, and Barry talked a bit about this in a particular situation that was in Southeast Asia, that video AI has really come a long way in the last 4 years. And now, you know, we are at the point now where we can really do very interesting artificial intelligence and analytics on video in real time, and really inform the police or whoever's in control of a situation as to what needs to happen, that alarm is generated, and you know, you need to act quickly. And so, you know, usually we see in policing situations that video AI is integrated into like a command and a control system that dispatches police to the incident. Okay, but it's also used, of course, not just for security, but in traffic management and parking and crowd management and a lot of things like facial recognitions, which I know we've talked a bit about before. So I think those two technologies have come leaps and bounds in the last 3 or 4 years, and I think they are a critical part of smart city, because drones and CCTV will collect a lot of information. I think the last one I wanted to cover a little bit was around smart infrastructure, and we've seen a lot change. Not so much in Australia yet, but in Europe a lot of this is going on. So in Europe, people have stopped thinking about street lamp posts as you know, dumb items that just have lights on top of them, and they've started to look at smart poles, which are a lot more. Now, these poles have a lot of new capability, and that includes being able to run edge computing in small data centers within the pole. And that type of environment is critical when we move forward, particularly if we're doing things like autonomous vehicles, where we really need to make instantaneous decisions about something that has to happen, or even with CCTV, where we don't want to ship all that video footage back. We want to make some kind of conclusion on the spot and then decide what data to ship back. So I think the future of these smart poles with the edge computing, and when you add that together with the 5G, really makes them more than just a pole. They become a true piece of infrastructure that will enable smart city going forward. And we've started to see that some of these poles in the US now have electrical vehicle charging attached to them, and they actually have drone charging and landing stations on the tops of the poles. So it's kind of like the infrastructure of the future that we're going to see, I think, happen in smart cities. So those are three areas I think that are changing a little bit and are really going to be significant when we move forward with our smart city plans. But just to conclude, how to get started on this journey, and I think I talked a little bit about this before, is it's really about engaging the community. And without the community, we can have smart things, but we can't have a smart city. We might be able to have a smart street light, but that doesn't always mean it's a smart city. And we might not be able to share the data unless we collectively come together. So I think this is just an example of who you might have in your stakeholder community for smart city. And I think a lot of councils, some have started on this journey, but lots are yet to happen. And I think that needs to happen. The second thing that we see a lot of in Australia is small pilots that are going on. And today, a lot of those pilots are not sustainable. They have not got a business case, or they don't have enough investment to roll out. So we think that realistically, doing something similar to some places in Europe like Copenhagen may in fact help us move forward a lot more. So what they have done is built a street living lab, and it's over about 400 acres right downtown in the center of Copenhagen. And in that area, they've actually implemented a number of different projects around waste and environment and parking and traffic and lighting and all these different things. But what it isn't a pilot. It's a living lab where technologies have been put in there to achieve some value. And from that, you can decide whether or not the technology is working. You can build business cases from it. And you can, equally as importantly, get the IT industry engaged in coming down and helping the council or the community build out. And I think this gives a good rallying point for the stakeholders or the community to come and see reality. Because at the end of the day, we need the citizens to understand the value of this, as well as, the elected officials and the rest of the community itself. So we believe that these are two good starting points, is to get your stakeholder community together and decide to build some kind of living lab, not a lab in a room somewhere, but a live lab. And from that, you can then start to realize the value, and you can start to build business cases to go and get funding or grant money from government or whatever, right? So I think I've covered just about everything, and I think we've talked a lot about smart cities. But I think, really smart cities in the future hopefully will become the norm. We talk a lot about it in Australia, but we haven't got enough action happening. And I think it will be our bridge to having a successful society in the future. So thank you very much, Shamir.
Thank you, Sue. That was a wonderful presentation, and I personally like the roadmap. So starting the journey and how cities can actually onboard in this. It's amazing. So at this point, let's open up the floor for discussions and Q&A. To start with, we'd love to hear if any of the panelists have any questions with regards to these, to the topics that we covered. George, Jitin, any questions?
I do believe that Sue probably summarized everybody's points in a very structured way. I think it's not just one element that is bringing smart city together, but I think any good implementation of smart city needs to have a framework and a roadmap to roll it out in a proper way. And a smart city is not just about technology, but also definitely needs to take into play what I would call the cultural element to drive adoption in the correct way. So something that may work in Asia, like for example, China, because the government says everybody follows. You go to the UK or you go to US or Canada and everybody thinks everybody's their own country. So, so you need to have a solution that at the same time also adapts to the people, not just to the government. So I think the right framework rollout of a smart city needs this element in order to be successful. So just imposing and pushing technology, data-driven, smart AI to the people is not going to be successful by itself, especially in Western technology. So as long as we combine these things together in a practical way through policies, then I think we have a better chance of success in the smart city implementations.
Yeah, and I think we have a really good opportunity now because there's nothing like, disaster to spur people on, right? So now's the time, truthfully, that we really need to think about, as you call it, a framework and a way forward. And, it needs to be done by a collective group of people, and communities, need to just come together and do that. It needs to include the citizens, not just businesses. It needs to be everybody.
I think a lot of these smart cities, and when you first start, they need to get a steering committee together. They need to get, the enterprises, they need to get the government, the different agencies, all to have a steering committee. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to a lot of reality things. And those reality things are about, like we talked about earlier, budgets. It's all about, what's the problem you're going to solve, how you're going to solve it, who owns it. So I think that, and you have to be flexible. And smart cities are going to have new departments. There's going to be a department of data, a separate department that owns that data, and it won't be any one of those verticals. So I think that, the whole government, everybody needs to be very flexible and open and understand that what you have now is not what you're going to have in the next 10, 15, 20 years out.
For sure. In fact, I agree completely with Sue on how she mentioned that it's very important to engage communities to participate in all these new different technology initiatives, right? Because technology as it is, it's not everything. It's just a enabler, but then these people or the communities needs to actively trust it and use it for this technology to be successful. However, I think there is a stigma around what Sue was actually talking about, right? The CCTV infrastructures which are smart. For example, I think a couple of days back, UK came up with a regulation which basically tells people that hey, it's not tracking people across all these different streets is not an ethical thing to do. However, I think it will be able to help people with a lot of situations as well, right? Detecting these accidents or finding people who are hostile or terrorist or whatever. So I think this is a question to Sue and rest of the panelists as well. How do you see governments engaging people to act, to get them to actively participate in these initiatives so that these are successful initiatives, right? Not just technology sitting there in one corner not being used properly. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think in Australia that citizens are engaged enough. And I really think that smart cities should be just citizen driven. I mean, I don't mean they have the plan, but it needs to be focused on the community and the citizens. And I don't think there's enough engagement, but I think a lot of that is because unfortunately we are in very early days in Australia around implementing true smart city initiatives or evolving our cities to be smart. So I don't think that, I think that's why I think part of this has to be, how do you actually engage the community and make them aware that all these things like CCTV, we're not going to share this data with everybody about your face. We're just here to make sure that everybody's safe and secure. So I think it needs to be driven by government around, people need to truly understand what technology can and can't do and what people are going to actually do with this data, but we don't seem to have that conversation. I think it needs to be had.
Yeah, I see one major thing is that, the government is not getting involved enough in the social network. I see that the social network has an opinion and all the citizens are on that network, whether it's the Twitter, whether it's the Facebook, they're there and they're commenting, but I don't see the government getting involved and saying, hey, look, you know what I mean? Being the one, because one of the things I've learned and I've heard is that when you look at the internet, you concentrate on your opinion. So you're on that whole thing with your opinion. You don't look at the other guy's opinion because it just upsets you and then you attack them. So, I think, and I don't know how you do it, and I don't think it's some kind of control, but I think that the government needs to learn how to be social engagement with the citizens.
When we did a piece of work in one of the Southeast Asian countries, and this came up, and so there was a whole strategy, and it was to do with CCTV. There was a whole strategy developed around citizen advocacy and how they were going to get buy-in from people, because it is an education, really is.
Understood.
Sorry.
Sorry. So I was just about to ask, so you fundamentally believe that, and it's more of a marketing initiative. So, technology needs, once there is an initiative, government needs to educate people. I'm not really sure if marketing is a wrong word, but, in this context, so government needs to really educate people on how it's being used. And, already we have a lot of these CCTV infrastructure where people are actually sitting behind those screens, which is even worse, right, in terms of privacy, because, there is another person seeing what exactly you do. But, with AI systems, these are AI tech looking at that information. It doesn't know who you are, how you do things. It doesn't know your family. So it's much better than having a person sitting behind those screens and, looking at you and, all your actions every single time, right? So, based on your experience, how do you see that communication happening, right? Is it primarily social media, or, how does that reach out or education strategy happening? How do you see that?
I think it would have to include social media as one of the mechanisms, but probably not the exclusive one. But, even in Australia, when we got the app for COVID-19, right, it kind of astounded everybody that not everybody adhered to this app or put the app on their phone, but a lot of people did, so we all say that we get totally concerned about being tracked, right? But the truth is we're tracked today, not just with COVID phones, but with lots of things. Google knows more about what we do than anybody else does. I think a lot of it is you would have to start with social media, but maybe there just needs to be a campaign around, in the future, there's going to be a lot more security put in at airports and ports, and even probably when we go into the shopping mall, things like that are going to happen. So maybe over the next couple of years, it'll become more acceptable, from people, because it will become the norm, right? It's just not the norm now. Perhaps it is, but people don't think of it that way.
I think they're, right now they're doing, the CCTV cameras are out there now, the new ones that have AI in it, right? And they're tracking the person, right? But only as the person, right? And if that person position, assumes a prone position that's known to be a problem with, then the cameras can go ahead and open up and identify. So that's already being taken care of. But so people can be tracked. They can be anonymously tracked. But again, it's about, does the public trust that issue? And, how reliable is it? But it's already, the governments in certain countries already know this. And so they already are tracking people anonymously. And AI is playing a huge role.
Thank you, Barry. So we're up to the last 4 minutes of today's session. If there are any audience questions, please leave them in the chat window. What I'd like to do is to have the last question for the day and keep it as short as you can and leave your closing remarks as well. So, we've all been talking about, whole digital transformation, the drive towards building smart cities. Do you think the current situation that we are in, which is the pandemic, has kind of, in a way, accelerated this? And why now? What are your thoughts on this? George?
Actually, I would say the pandemic to some extent has forced us to be more agile. What it means is it was kind of like a wake-up call. And it really goes much beyond just the government response and all that. We have to really understand that businesses that were not agile and not ready for crisis management or addressing the issues of pandemic, they're simply going to see their business shrink tremendously. However, the businesses that were able to pivot or able to adopt by adding extra innovation through simple technologies, but it's not just adding innovation, it's adding innovation in an agile way. It means we're talking in 30, 60, 90 days and being able to profit from it. So they can do much better. I have a colleague of mine, for example, from Canada that now lives in California. His name is Patrick Schwartz. I always have trouble with his last name. However, he was able to write a book called Pandemic Inc. Guess what? His book was out by end of January. If you're writing a book about pandemic and it comes out in December, it's too late. So if you're able to respond to it in a timely manner. So in this case, Patrick, as a business, responded to the pandemic in his most effective way. So the same thing has to happen to every business out there. You need to be able to be effective and agile.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Barry, any thoughts?
A couple of ones. I think the pandemic, right, it's affected everything, the GDP, the social, security, everything that we thought we were safe at. And now we find out we're very vulnerable to these things, right? And we've been forced into the new norm. And the new norm now is, working at home and participating in meetings and doing all your business from home and not having the need to go ahead and physically shake somebody's hands anymore. Deals are now being cut over the video, and business is starting to operate that way. We see that, offices won't, right now we have office buildings. Some of them are not, people are never going to come back to that stuff. So I think that the whole world's going to change because of this and the way we do business. And, we don't even shake hands anymore. We, touch elbow, touch feet. Everything that we know is gone, and we need to get used to that and accept that there's a new norm, there's a new way, and maybe it's a better way. So I think that's my opinion on this whole pandemic.
Thank you, Barry. Jitin?
Yeah, sure. Like Barry was saying, right? This pandemic has affected in two different ways, and it has affected our social side of life, right? And then the economical side of things, right? So the GDP of a lot of these nations has gone down dramatically, and same as with companies in terms of their bottom line. Almost everybody's hit. So it was important for all these people or companies or governments to figure out ways to kind of reduce the cost, their operational costs. So that made RPA really, really relevant. And, that market is growing like crazy. So people are adopting RPA tech to see, if they can actually automate any of these tasks and, any of their SOP, which otherwise, people was working on. So that definitely helped the growth of RPA market. And the second part, any government or enterprise, I fundamentally believe that, it's not about the product or services they provide. At the end of the day, every business is about the people, right? And it's important for that people to communicate and collaborate, right? Which used to happen traditionally in all these different office spaces, right? I mean, people could just go to the desk of another person and then have a chat and say like, hey, let's get this done. Right now, we have to kind of do that over Zoom or Slack, right? And I think, for maintaining that communication and collaboration, it became really, really important for all these enterprises and governments to adopt, digital technologies, right? Which could help them still, which could help them work even when they cannot meet each other. I think, that has increased the adoption of digital technologies quite a bit during the pandemic. And I think, that was a push which was necessary as well, making, these companies, governments, and as speeches, us more resilient towards any of these disasters, which is inevitable because of the things that we are anyways doing, right? So.
Thank you. Thanks, Jitin. Sue, any closing remarks?
Oh, look, I agree with all of the speakers. I think now's the time, since COVID and a number of other things that have happened this year in Australia, now's the time for real disruption. And I think, it's the era that we need to take advantage and decide what we want the future to look like. And I think technology will play a significant role in that.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. The wonderful panelists that we have with us today have joined in from 3 different cities, from Australia, from Dubai, from India. I think we had a very productive discussion today, and hope to see you all on our next sessions. Thank you again, once and all. Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thanks, Shimon. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Yes.
Bye. Have a good day.